So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Ken Lang from Ontario to give us a talk on equipment he's been using for no-till vegetables. I really enjoyed sitting in on the Ecological Agriculture Conference of Ontario, where Ken had more time to really show his entire research operation, but super impressed with what he's been learning about equipment and wanted him to share his knowledge with you all. So take it away, Ken.
So this whole project that I'm reporting on today is funded by Agriculture Canada, and the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario is sort of another partner. And I'm specifically looking at developing organic no-till strategies for vegetables. And specifically, it's really aimed at sort of medium-sized farms from 10 to 50 acres. So it's mechanized, tractor-based system based on 60-inch beds, and trying to avoid the use of agriculture plastics, really trying to depend on biological solutions. And a little bit about myself. I mean, I've been farming for over 40 years, 30 of those organic, and for about 20 years we were a pick-your-own small fruit farm, and then the last 20 years we were a CSA, ended up around 250 shares, so sort of a medium-sized CSA. And we've grown hay and pasture and field crops in that time as well. I farm with my wife Martha and now my daughter Ellen, and I'm sort of semi-retired. So I've taken on this project the last couple of years with the Living Labs. And we're located where the orange arrow is, just on the north shore of Lake Erie, about halfway between Detroit and Buffalo. We're in Zone 5 of the U.S. Plant hardiness zones. So typical of sort of the very southern part of Vermont or the state of Massachusetts. And we're about the same latitude as the border between Vermont and Massachusetts. And we have a variety of soils, but where we have most of these trials, it's a sandy loam soil, well-drained, no stones, a prime location for growing vegetables. So the different techniques we've tried, we borrowed the deep compost mulch from some smaller scale farmers. So we're using about 2 inches of spent mushroom compost, and sometimes we put that on tilled soil, sometimes on a winter-killed cover crop, or even a rolled cover crop. And we've also seeded or transplanted into winter-killed cover crops like sorghum sudan, or a mixture of sorghum sudan and sun hemp, or pearl millet by itself, or pearl millet combined with cowpeas, or daikon by itself. And then we've also tried the roller, sometimes in hairy vetch and rye, sometimes hairy vetch or crimson clover by themselves, and then also a flail mowing technique before transplants or after seeding, and the cover crops involved were a combination of rye and hairy vetch, pearl millet, and cowpeas. So the deep compost mulch, this is the best machine we found for applying it, PTO Manure Spreader. We had to turn the wheels inside out to get them to be on 60-inch centers to match our beds. Excuse me, the bed of the spreader is about 42 inches wide, and by the time it drops it down, it covers the 48-inch top of the bed. And by varying the speed of the tractor and the table chain, you can put on pretty much whatever thickness of deep compost mulch you want. And that spreader was manufactured by Lancaster, which is an Amish company down in Pennsylvania. And here we have a vacuum planter that we set up for some vegetable crops. You can't actually go to the machinery market and buy a no-till vegetable seed planter. So this was sort of my solution to that problem. A typical corn, soybean, no-till vacuum planter by John Deere. I went with a vacuum planter because it has a little more flexibility in terms of the seed size it'll handle depending on the plates and the vacuum pressure and that sort of thing. You can see that top red arrow is pointing at a shop vac. We ran that off an inverter and battery mounted on the tractor, and gave us the vacuum. Normally it would come from a PTO or hydraulically driven vacuum pump, but it didn't come with this planter. So, and then the next arrow down that goes from the seed box points at an adjustment spring, so you can vary the down pressure right up to 400 pounds per row. And then that required actually my pointer works here. That's great. So we filled the 7x7 toolbar with concrete to give us enough weight because the machine itself has to transfer that weight to your openers. And then there's a single wavy coulter in front of your double disc openers, and there's a little firming device here to push the seed down into the trench. It's not what I would call a great vegetable seeder. It was challenging to calibrate it. The seed metering mechanism is not visible. You can't actually look and check whether all the cells are filled. So it was not as a great a seeder as I wished. But you can see here the challenges where we're planting into rolled rye, a lot of residue, and soil that's full of roots, difficult to open a trench and get it closed again with this sort of conventional setup. So here we have a solution to closing a trench. We switched from these sort of typical press wheels to an all steel press wheel with points on it to try to close that trench and get the seed covered up. And here's a home-built no-till drill. It just happened to be one that we had used for cereal grains, but here it just happened to fit these 5-foot beds. It has crust buster openers. They're a double disc opener, one notch blade, one smooth blade. One blade's a little bit ahead of the other. And I've never plugged this thing in very heavy residue, so it works quite well. There's a tank here for liquid amendments, or you can just fill it up and use the extra weight, and you can see some well-armored sections of this drill to put the extra weight to keep it in the ground. And it's actually a horse-drawn implement that we hauled with 3 horses, and that's why we have an electric over hydraulic control here. But we were using it, in this case, next slide. We're working in a field of winter-killed sorghum Sudan grass, and actually we used it to plant spinach in one trial and peas in another. It didn't work well for peas because the fluted roller mechanism was chewing up some of the pea seeds. They were a little bit too big. But you can see here the press wheels, which also control the depth, give you a good seed-to-soil contact. And it's a good device, certainly for cover crops or cereal grains. And here's the main implement we use. We did actually get this RJ equipment, NoTill Transplanter. It's manufactured at a small firm just about an hour away from me in southern Ontario. And we've used it for planting transplants, garlic, and potatoes. We have a small pail up here to supply the water or transplant solution to the openers. And looking here at the front, it's got a floating row cleaner ahead of a large wavy coulter. And you've got double disc openers here on the opening shoe. And actually these press wheels are set up for bare soil. You'll see that we've modified that to work to close the trench better. This machine was very heavy. It probably weighs about a ton, sticks out a long ways behind a tractor, so you need a good-sized tractor just to lift the thing. The tractor on there is about a 75 horsepower with front-wheel drive and some front weights, and still the front end gets a little light. It also has a blue shank, which is suitable for subsurface tillage, for loosening up the soil right in the row, which helps for some crops. This machine cost about $14,000 Canadian when we purchased it. Given the price rise in steel, it's probably quite a bit more than that now. So it's not an inexpensive machine. Here we are planting into rolled oats and peas. We've got a rigid row cleaner, which we used at first, but it didn't work very well. It was either digging a trench or missing its job altogether. The floating row cleaner worked much better. You can see the coulter is doing a good job of cutting through the residue, and we've got our subsurface tillage shank working in place. And here we have the floating row cleaner. These aluminum wheels control the depth, and the whole thing floats, and it won't drop down too.
Recording in progress.
And we've planted them into rolled rye and vetch. They did have a struggle to get established, probably because the trench wasn't closed properly. The tapered plugs were probably just contacting the soil on 2 sides, not 4. And but in the end, they actually produced a very good crop. Next slide. And here they are at the end of the season. Quite a good crop. We did not do a yield measurement on this, but that's a very heavy crop of face tomatoes. Plum Regal, I think, was the variety there. Pretty good weed control as well. Quite acceptable. And here we have a slide of us planting potatoes. This was April 21st of 21. And here you can see we've actually taken those old press wheels, the wide ones, and put them on the back to add some extra weight to close the trench. And yeah, we're planting into rye vetch in this bed. And okay, next slide. So about 3 weeks later, just when the first potatoes are emerging, we come in with a flail mower and mow off the rye and vetch, leave a good mulch to cover the soil and control the weeds. Next slide. And that bed to the right is hairy vetch, and you'll see some crimson clover in the background as well. So here we are, June 30th, the same beds, and you know, very good weed control, very good termination of the rye and vetch with the flail mower, and very good emergence in those potatoes. This variety is one we selected on our farm back in 2016. We were looking for a variety that would be resistant to potato leafhopper, and this is a very resistant variety, and it also very vigorous, and that's why we used it in this no-till trial. Next slide. And here we are just before harvest. The plants are dying down, very good weed control by and large. And here we are digging the early planted ones. This is August 30th. We didn't mow off the plants. We got a little skinning you'll see on these bigger tubers because the skins weren't hardened up. But actually, we got this machine to dig in this very firm soil because it hasn't been tilled since the year before at the beginning of September when the cover crops were planted. We also got a very good yield. The yields in these plots were running in excess of 30,000 pounds per acre, or 300 weights per acre if you want to use the old sort of arcane measurement. Next slide. And this is a very typical, simple 3-point hitch potato digger. It did have a straight bar across here. Whoops. We had to add these pointed plates. The local manufacturer that produces this machine, it's Wilsey Equipment. They were able to bolt these on, and that was enabled it to dig into the firm ground that these potatoes were growing in. It wouldn't dig them with just the straight undercutter bar. And then we added these hilling discs on the edge to handle the mulch and residue that was on the ground. So that's a 60-inch wide digger. So we were digging the whole bed, 2 rows at once. And those potato rows, one nice thing about no-till situations, you can actually play with row spacings because you don't really have to worry about tillage equipment. There was no tillage for weed control. There was no tillage for hilling. And all these plots you'll see, there was no hand weeding or mechanical weeding after planting. We wanted to be able to see the weed control. So here's a roller crimper we used for 60-inch wide beds. It's a off-the-shelf unit made by the Yetter company, and it's made to clamp on the front of a corn planter or soybean planter to roll the cover crop ahead of it, and it clamps right on the pallet forks. And you can just put the loader on float and go down your row of cover crop or your bed of cover crop. And here we have a bed of hairy vetch. We've just rolled it probably the day before. Here we have come in and planted winter squash, this variety butterscotch. We chose it because it doesn't, it's a butternut type, but it's sort of semi-dwarf plant, so it doesn't vine into the next bed so badly. And here you can see my modified press wheel. And here we have the 2 beds here on the right were planted into rye and vetch. Those plants had a bad struggle, not very productive. Over here we have the row that you just looked at of these winter squash planted into the bed of pure hairy vetch. And here you have some yield numbers, which really shows pure, even rye with hairy vetch, pretty big struggle, not a great yield. Transplanted into the rolled hairy vetch, double the yield, and where we had plots with deep compost mulch on top of various cover crops, another big yield bump. Whether it's enough to pay for, those 2 inches of deep compost mulch, with my rule of thumb, each inch is about 50 tons per acre. So you got 100 tons per acre of compost to pay for. So you want to know what your yield and your market price is before you try that technique. But it can be very productive. Next slide. And here we are using the same transplanter to plant garlic in the fall. This is the fall of 2020. So we're planting into a pretty heavy residue of sorghum Sudan grass. I believe it was mowed once, sort of in mid-growing season, to produce even more biomass. And we had enough biomass that it made it a challenge to plant with this machine, but we got it in the ground. Next slide. This tractor also has a creeper gear, which is really handy for transplanting. You can see my wife Martha here is actually feeding both carousel hoppers here. Next slide. And here we are. Whoops, went 2 slides. Just back up one. There's one in between, I think, Vern. It'll show you.
Sorry, is this what you want?
No, it's the one of the garlic field in the spring, where the garlic's 4 inches tall. There should be one in between there. You were at it at one point. There we are. So we have some beds here. We've got 4 rows in a 60-inch bed, so they're 12 inches apart, and the spacing in the row is 5 to 6 inches. And here we are at harvest time, relatively weed-free, very acceptable weed control. You can still see a bit of mulch from the sorghum Sudan grass. The one challenge of this, having sorghum Sudan grass as your cover crop, it really occupies a full growing season before the garlic, because it has to be planted probably sometime in June, and it can be mowed a couple of times to increase the biomass and root growth, but it really occupies a full growing season ahead of the garlic. Next slide. Oh, I guess I should mention the yields in those garlic plots were very good, in excess of 11,000 pounds per acre, and the average bulb size was around 72 grams, which is actually a pretty respectable size. And this is my motto: live like you're going to live forever, or live like you're going to die tomorrow, and farm like you're going to live forever. And this is my granddaughter. I think she's going to grow up to be a soil scientist because she's figuring out a new soil testing techniques. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was super informative. I think you have a lot of questions in the chat. So I think we'll take a few minutes out of the social hour that's coming a little bit later, answer a few questions verbally, and then maybe you can get to them by responding in the chat so we can move on in a couple of minutes. Becky, did you pick out a top question or two?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That was really cool. I'm gonna have to study that up a little more. So one question is about rodent pressure on the longer standing winter covers, or the longer standing cover crops in general.
We didn't have any trouble with rodents, but I'm not saying you never will, because I remember planting oats and barley into some fall carrots and planting too early. And we ended up with a shoulder of every carrot nibbled. So.
Great. Another question is if you had any greening on those no-till potatoes, and someone is also wondering what variety you used.
Yeah, we did have some trouble with greening. And the curious thing, we didn't have any problems in the first dig where we didn't mow the plants off. But in the second we did, and we mowed them off and left them for a week. And we also had 5 inches of rain in that time. So the rain may have washed some of the residue off those surface potatoes. I think we had something like 7,000 pounds per acre of green potatoes out of in excess of 30,000 pounds. So it was significant. We still had pretty good yield even with those graded out. The variety, I call it Orchard Hill Rose. It's not a registered variety yet, although it's very productive. Red skin, sort of a white flesh, but very resistant to potato leaf hopper, which is a big problem for us. They'll actually kill our plants by harvest time. We don't have to worry about, mowing off most varieties like that my daughter grows, because they're dead by harvest time.
Great, thank you. I guess one last question would be what you're doing for irrigation in those no-till areas.
We have sprinkler irrigation. And they were irrigated twice in the spring because it was very dry here in like May and June. That's very unusual for us. They were not irrigated again because we ended up having a very wet season, very frequent light rains, and we had 2 very heavy precipitation events. One was 4.5 and the other was the 5 inches of rain, which is unusual for us as well.
Great. I think we
I'll
can
ask one more, Becky, just because I also want to add to it. It's a question of how many yards would be the equivalent of the 2 inches of compost? And also, do you have any regulations about phosphorus application up there? Because for a lot of farms down here, that amount of compost would not be allowed.
No, small farms like mine are not regulated. I think if you have a livestock farm with over 300 animal units, yes, you are regulated. But I think there's also a question is, you know, it's compost, it's not manure. And it would be really nice to see some science as to what happens. I know there's a lot of phosphorus in that compost, but whether it's actually causing an environmental problem, I'm not so sure. But it's a good question that needs to be answered. And you don't go on using that year after year. That's the other issue. It's often used maybe once. And
just one time or some interim rotation?
Well, and it's not a large scale technique. Like if I had a 50-acre vegetable farm, I would not be using deep compost mulch as a large scale technique. I would have trouble probably accessing that amount of compost.
And I think you said in your other talk, is that from a mushroom producer, or where do you get it?
Yeah, this particular bunch that we used in the past year was mostly spent mushroom compost. It's good, you know, thermal produced compost, no weed seeds in it, but we did have some problems where sometimes the dealer, he stockpiles it on his farm, and then when he scoops it up, he'll scoop up a bit of soil, and then that will introduce some weeds. And then when it's dumped at my farm, sometimes when I'm scooping it up, I get some soil, and that would introduce some weeds. So you've got to be careful with those sort of transfer points.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Ken. You're a fount of knowledge on this. And if you can get some questions in the chat, or I know you gave people your contact info, we appreciate that.